Hi everybody, it's Isaac from Shiloh again. I'd like to share with you something I've learned from the 7 churches of Asia Minor. You may have heard about them. This may be new to you, so I'm just going to try to give a simple explanation. There are 2 chapters in the last book of the New Testament called the Book of the Revelation. It's the oldest book, or oldest written book in our Bibles. And these 2 chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 3, Jesus speaks to 7 churches. And there's lots of theories about if it represents anything else or if it's just the churches there. I'm not going to go into that. Instead, I want to look at some of the principles that are involved with what Jesus has to say and what they've been doing. They're kind of surprising because he points out something positive with every one of these churches. If you look at the church at Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 1, you'll see the first few verses there discuss Ephesus. He says a lot of good stuff. I made a list. He knows about their works and their sorrow, their labor, how they've been patient, how they don't tolerate evildoers, and they're careful about who they listen to. Like if somebody comes and says that they're a messenger from God, they say, okay, let's prove it. Before we accept what you have to say, let's see how it works. Does it test what we already know from Jesus and from his apostles? And they were very careful in that respect. They lasted. They had a capacity of tenacity. They could just stick with it. Keep on having church, I guess, if we wanted to use a common American sort of expression. The next church in chapter 2 and verse 8, we see the church at Smyrna. And it says that he knows about their works. All these people, he says, hey man, I see you've done works. Y'all, you're doing things. I get that. He looks at their tribulation, the difficulties they've been going through, how people have been treating them because of who they have associated with. He mentions their poverty and that they shouldn't focus on the poverty because really they're rich. He points out that he knows people are speaking against their message. Lots of good stuff he's pointing out here. The church at Pergamos in chapter 2 and verse 12, again, he points out his works, their works, and if nothing else, he points out that they've been doing a lot of stuff in Jesus' name. If you look in chapter 2 and verse 13, it says, I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. Whether they were doing everything right or not, it seemed like they were really, really focused on making sure people knew who they were associated with. Moving on, Thyatira. I've always had trouble with that word. Is it Thyatira? Is it Thyatira? Thyatira. If I said that wrong, comment down below. Educate me. I'm okay with that. Chapter 2 and verse 18, we see this church at Thyatira. He points out a lot of really good things. In verse 19, I know your works, your love, service, faith, your patience. I love this phrase. And as for your works, the last are more than the first. You've just gotten better. And what an awesome thing to have that recorded time in memoriam about you and your church. That's great. Matter of fact, a lot of these churches, man, they've got a ton of good things being said about them. 2,000 years later, we get to read about the good things. Then we move on to chapter 3. You've got the church at Sardis. He doesn't have much good to say about them. A little. I know your works and your reputation. Look at 3 and verse 1. Verse 2. I know your works and that you have a name, that you're alive. That's the reputation part. That you have a reputation, that you're alive. Some churches would really love to have that reputation and are struggling to find it. Then you've got the Philadelphian church. In 3 and verse 7 is where you can begin to read about them. I know your works, he says. You have a little strength, and you've kept my word, and you have not denied my name. I think that, what was it, back in the 90s when that first school shooting happened? Church camp that year, the speaker of the week discussed one girl's commitment to that she said yes. Somebody put a gun to her head, said, "Are you a Christian, or do you believe in Jesus Christ?" She said yes, and he pulled the trigger and killed her. Tragic and awful, but it made it very real for me when I was a teenager in the 90s to hear that given to me. And I had to ask myself, would I say yes? And of course, it's church camp, and it's like Sunday school on steroids. And so everybody is naturally going to say, yes, yes, of course we would say yes. But when we're alone with ourselves and our thoughts, I think some of us would have more difficulty being honest with ourselves about the struggle, the ethical struggle. I'll say no just to get out of the situation, then I'll keep professing the name of Jesus Christ. You know, that's the first answer I came up with. You lose the battle to win the war. That was my thinking. Philadelphia had to go through a lot, and they were still very dedicated, and here he points that out. Their strength, their loyalty, that they would keep on keeping on. Awesome things. Then we get to the 7th church, a church in a place called Laodicea. I can't find anything good that Jesus has to say about them. And that's surprising, since all of the other ones who were in different states of wrongdoing, he could still manage to find good to be said about them. He really didn't have anything good to say about them here. And that's surprising. But, again, he had a lot of bad things to say too. Not that he was bad talking, but they had faults, a lot of these churches, that needed to be corrected. Out of the 7, there were 5 that he had really big problems with. With Ephesus, the church that had the good works, that dealt with a lot of sorrow and had to practice a lot of patience, that was careful about the messengers that they brought in and who they would listen to, and that they were intolerant of evildoers who would be in that body. All awesome things. And he said, nevertheless, I have this against you, that you've lost your first love, or rather, you've left your first love. To the church at Smyrna, he has nothing bad to say. Pergamos, they had accepted two doctrines that were not from Christ, not from his apostles. And we don't know very much about them other than that they involved eating food that had been sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. If you like looking at Greek words, it's not talking about anything in specific. Rather, it's just talking about the act of fornication. It was a problem. Linking it to a doctrine of Balaam, it suggests that it was like temple prostitution that they had begun to assimilate into their Christian culture, which is, it's hard for us to look at this and say, how did they get there from where they started? And I agree. How do you go from, we love Jesus, we follow Jesus, we're listening to his commandments, we have given up so much to believe in him, but let's go ahead and do some of that temple prostitution thing. It's just really strange, isn't it? In Thyatira, he had a problem with a woman named Jezebel, and he said he's dealt with her. He's given her time. But they had not only allowed this woman to come in with bad doctrine, but allowed her to teach and seduce other people into those same sort of things, eating food sacrificed to idols and committing acts of sexual immorality. Now, the issue of eating food sacrificed to idols, that's a topic for another day. I would say that it's not patently a sin for them to have done that. It's conditional. Paul speaks about that quite a bit, and if you ever want to read up on that, look in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 9, and 10. He addresses this issue of the struggle people were going through, because meat sacrificed to idols was a lot cheaper. It was easier to afford, and that made it very appealing if you're on a limited income. So anyway, Thyatira, they had problems. They were listening to the wrong people. And that woman didn't make them commit sin, but they allowed themselves to be led into committing sin. And that's significant. Then you've got the church at Sardis. I know your works, he says in, let's see, chapter 3. That you have a name, that you're alive, verse 2, or verse 1. But his problem that he had with them, it's a pretty big one. I know your works, that you have a name, that you're alive, but you're dead. Necros, dead. How would you feel about Jesus saying something like that to your church? The interesting thing about this particular one is that not everybody was involved in this. He says in verse 4, you have a few names, even in Sardis, who have not yet defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they're worthy. Imagine this letter coming around where Jesus Christ, the one who is your reason for being together, and he says, you guys are dead. There is no life in you. Man, that hurts. And don't you know, in my own self-righteousness, if the letter were read to me, I would look around and say, I've been telling you guys, this is wrong. This is no good. This is a sin, the way we're living. And then I would wash my hands of any guilt. Now, in modern age, what would happen is we would likely go find another church, or we would start our own church. We'll call it some kind of mean name sometimes. Graceful Ones Missionary Baptist Church. We Stand United. The full Council of God Missionary Baptist Church. I'm just making up with names because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, and I don't want to say that anybody named their church because of things like that, but it is kind of something funny to think about once in a while. And while he points out that there were some who had not defiled themselves, they're still roped in as a church with these people. I find it interesting, first of all, that they didn't leave to form their own body. They didn't leave to go to another church. They were there. Maybe they felt stuck in their situation. Maybe they felt committed. If you get in the habit of church hopping, it's very easy to continue church hopping. And we'll always rationalize why we were here for a year and here for a year and here for a year and here for a year. But then I believe that there were probably many who they looked at these people who were wrong, and they saw it as an occasion of pity and remorse. Not that they would want to give up on them, that they couldn't give up on them. This is us, and we're going to stay here. And you see that sort of behavior happening in the epistles when councils are being formed, arguing over what's the most righteous action, this or that. And then Paul would have to come in as the referee and tell them what for. In today's church climate, where we have a lot of choice, I think a lot of us would be inclined to take our ball and go play somewhere else. And I think it's beautiful. And it's off the subject, but it's beautiful for a church body to have so much security among its members that when a disagreement comes up, it's not a matter of leaving or staying. That's not a choice that comes to their mind, but rather we've got to figure out a way to get through this. So anyway, nothing really tempered what he was saying about that. It just reinforced it. They're dead. Philadelphia is another good church. We've got Smyrna and Philadelphia, the two good ones. And he had no bad things to say about Philadelphia. Now, they were going through some difficult times, but nothing bad about them. And then we've got Laodicea. And again, it's the church that Jesus found nothing worth talking about in the positive. He didn't say anything good to them about them. He did have some bad things to say. And they seem to be categorized under two things. They had an issue with uncommitted works and an issue of pride from their wealth. I think if we look at some of these, we can see them usually in other churches easier than we can see them in our own church. A church that does so many good things right, but it's not about Jesus anymore. I think we could very quickly identify other churches that qualify that way. Churches that have done good things, but they've accepted false doctrines. And look, he's not dealing with issues of disagreement in the finer mechanics of doctrine. Pre-trib or post-trib, middle of the week, pre-wrath. millennialism, amillennialism. He's not dealing with the finer issues of observing the Lord's Supper, of the ordinance of baptism. These people are dealing with significantly bigger issues, accepting idol worship through prostitution. All sins condemn us. Not all sins are equal. Those are bigger than the argument between some over closed communion, close communion, open communion, restricted communion. These were major issues. And with all these pros and cons, I also want to point out that Jesus still looked at them as their churches, as his churches. That's significant because in missionary Baptist circles, for all my life, I've heard some pretty ugly language about anybody who's not us and not exactly like us in us. Well, they're not a real church. I've heard that one so many times I can hardly stand it. And they'll give the reasons, and sometimes those reasons are because they, the way they organize. Sometimes it's because they have practiced or accepted a doctrine that we don't agree with. And I want you to consider these 7 churches, because with each of these groups, they were doing things that, with each of them, with 5/7 of these people, they were doing things that I think some of our brethren would say they're not a real church. Jesus is calling them a real church, though. With each one, he opens up by saying, to the messenger of the church of Ephesus, the messenger of the church in Smyrna, messenger of the church in Pergamos, messenger of the church in Thyatira, messenger of the church in Sardis, and to the messenger at the church at Philadelphia, and to the messenger of the church of the Laodiceans. They're all churches. They're churches in error. They're churches that are struggling. They're churches that are, 5/7 of them are having issues where they have strayed away from where God would have them to be. So what I like to do when I see groups like this categorized by group, and then basically there's a pros and cons list that God has given out, I do the same thing, and I look for commonalities. And there's some there. They seem to be doing things in some ways right. 5 of them were doing things that were wrong, but they weren't monumentally huge things. Like the things they were doing wrong were wrong. But they weren't things that you couldn't come back from or that you couldn't correct. And I think that we tend to fall for something called the sunk costs fallacy. Now, the sunk cost fallacy, if you've never heard of it, it's very simple. It's the idea that I have invested so much that I don't want to lose the investment. Almost 20 years ago, took my brand new wife, Stephanie, it was 18 years ago, out to a movie called Vanilla Sky. Don't go watch it. The billboards looked great. You've got Tom Cruise and you've got Cameron Diaz when she was still hugely popular, and went into the theater, we watched it, it was awful. And it continued to be awful. Like from the word go, we just didn't get it, didn't like it, and didn't want it. But because I am notoriously thoughtful about the money I spend, maybe you'd say frugal or cheap, in my mind I said, well, we paid this money. We're going to get the entertainment value out of it. Even if we didn't enjoy ourselves. And ultimately we did end up walking out. It's like the only movie we've ever walked out on. But sunk cost fallacy says you don't like the movie, you stay there. You paid for the ticket. You're not going to enjoy yourself, but you paid for it. You're going to get it. It's a fallacy we commit a lot. Sometimes when you go to a nice restaurant, you'll order something that looks good on paper. Maybe their picture looks really good. And then you get it and you're like, man, this is no good. This is gross. One bit of heresy I will confess to, and many of you will likely agree, is the way I cook my steaks. I like them well done. I don't like pink. Pink is gross. It's no good. Yuck. When you put your knife into the steak and something other than delicious brown tainted clear juice comes out, no, I don't like it. And you can explain to me all the mechanics and the science, and then I'm being silly, and the taste is different and better when it's more rare. It's gross. Sunk cost fallacy says if you're in a restaurant where you couldn't send it back, you're going to cut that steak open and you're going to say, well, this is not what I wanted. If I wanted a well-done steak and somebody brought me one that was rare, medium rare, I'd say, well, I paid for this thing. I'm going to eat it. I'm not going to like it at all, but I'm going to eat it because I paid for it. I feel like that may be something that you can relate to. Maybe you've been in a relationship and a certain amount of time has passed and you say, man, this person is toxic in my life. None of us know about that, do we? And then we come to that moment when we're sitting alone with our thoughts and we say, I can't cut them out. They've been in my life for this long. I've put this much time, this much emotion, this much money into this relationship. I can't get out now. And of course, again, when it's somebody else, it's easier to identify how crazy that is. But I wonder if churches might have that same struggle, that going back is really hard. And it's not worth going back. And the funny thing is, you look at the pros, you see some commonalities. You look at the cons, you see some commonalities among these 7 churches. The prescribed actions that Jesus gave them are pretty common too. They boil down to the same 3 simple principles. Take stock of the things that you're still doing right. That's an important one. If you feel like you can't do anything right, or if somebody has some sort of not a vendetta, but they've got a problem with you and they tell you about it. If you're anything like me, I can get so focused on that I can't begin to think about anything good. I lose my value. I think that may be why Jesus began by saying, look, I understand you're doing good things. There's some things that aren't so good though, and we need to talk about that. So whenever he tells them what they do good and what they're doing that's bad, he then prescribes to them some action, or even sometimes a state of mind. And that first one is, look around, remember where you came from. That was one that came up more than once. Remember where you came from. Do you do that? So 20 years ago, when I began preaching, my pastor, Verlin Wood, did a fantastic job of giving me preaching experience, both in the pulpit and in sending me to churches that needed fill-ins. And that was in May of 2000. So we're coming up right at 20 years. That's unreal. There was one place I went to. It was south of Pine Bluff. I believe their name was Center in Rowell. Pre-GPS, you could get on the internet and you could Google where it is, but you kind of just had to trace your finger along the route that you wanted and then write it down later. Hope that you can decipher your instructions. There was one map, I think it's MapQuest. How's that for nostalgia? MapQuest. That would give you turn-by-turn instructions. The only problem with that is if you miss a turn, everything from then on in those instructions no longer work. And I kept at least 2 maps in my glove box, always. And I remember missing my turn somewhere, not knowing exactly where. I missed the road sign. I was listening to DC Talk or something along those lines. And then I'd pull out my map and say, well, I'm somewhere along this road. If I turn left enough, I should be able to turn back towards where I'm going. And I think that may have been a temptation for some of these churches. Let's take where we are and just try to veer back into God's righteousness. I know that's a problem that again, I have, and I try to be very honest with people about my own shortcomings when I can see them. But I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back and look for the turn that I missed. I want to go forward and keep progressing and hopefully making incremental changes I can get to where I was supposed to be all along. It might just take a little longer. And I would, of course, try to drive in such a way where I would make up for that lost time. That happened one time north of Cave City, outside the great mecca of evening shade in a little burb called Poughkeepsie. I got in such a hurry to make up lost time because of this exact thing that I totaled my car. I'm so thankful to be alive because it was a bad car. I rolled my car end over end and side over side, ran into a bluff wall. My night got a lot longer. I was on my way from Mountain View to Jonesboro, going an unfamiliar way because I wanted to stop at Cave City. There was a church there that had some sort of a special speaker, a great speaker. And rather than to go the route that I knew was good, the route that I knew, I tried to take the shortcut. Well, if I keep going eastish, I should get to Jonesboro eventually. Apparently, I didn't have a very profound understanding of how roads work. Now, the ideal thing would have been for me to, from that church, take the extra 15 minutes to get back on the road I needed to. The lesser ideal thing, but still better than what happened, would have been for me to go back to the last known good place, the last correct place, to get back on course. And instead, I ended up back in my college town, like 4 hours after I should have been there. I spent more time. I lost a car. I got in a wreck, cut myself up with glass, nothing bad. Because I didn't want to go back to the first things. Now look at what Jesus told the Ephesian church in chapter 2 and verse 5. Remember therefore from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works. Go back to those things that you were doing that were right. First prescription that he gives to those churches. Take stock of the things you are doing right. Second thing, remember when everything was good. If things aren't working out right with what you're doing now, go back and assess the situation when it was good. Look at what good things you were doing then. See what was involved in for lack of a better word, your success. And then Jesus again and again says, repent and go back to that. Look at the good you're doing. Remember when everything was good. And then 3, go back and do that. I think that's probably the hardest part, because I am a sucker for sunk costs. The need to try to make what I'm doing work when I need to just go back. So my encouragement for y'all is, if you find yourself in a position where Jesus would have charges against you, look at what you're doing that's right. Remember the time when everything was going right, when your actions were right. Not that the world around you just fell into your lap and you had tons of good fortune. But when you were doing everything right, look back at that time and then do that. Now, one thing I want you to see in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 19, this is a big one. This is, well, I'll just read it. As many as I love, I rebuke and I chasten. These people that had committed acts of immorality, that had stopped their practice and their thinking of Jesus being imminent and real and the first thing on their minds and the one who defines everything that we do. They had become adulterous in a religious sense. But Jesus affirmed how he felt about them. Specifically, this is after the Laodicean church. As many as I love, I rebuke and I chasten. If I were to reword that, I would say, he's not saying these hurtful things or these upsetting things because he doesn't like you. He's saying them because he does. And that's important. So in future videos, I may talk more about some of the specific churches, because this has always been an interest of mine. Not the book of the Revelation, but specifically these churches. And there's a lot of inspiration and a lot of learning that can be had from them. I hope your Sunday has been good so far. It's about 3 o'clock now. I'm trying to upload these as quick as I can. I lack the tools and lack some of the skills to get them up as quick as possible. Yet the second video I posted took about 12 hours from the time I completed the video to the time it hit YouTube, just because I guess my abilities in doing this aren't right. I don't know how to do it all yet. So thank you for your patience. I'm trying to get these out in a timely manner. And if you have ideas for future videos, something you would like to see discussed, I'd love to get in on it. I'd love to hear about it. Comment or message me. Let me know. Remember to sanitize anytime you leave the house. Sanitize when you come back in the house. Be safe. The church will remain, Shiloh will remain closed this week. No Wednesday services, no Sunday night services, no extra activities related to Shiloh. And so do keep that in mind and plan accordingly. I'm going to continue to try, let me rephrase that. I'm about to trip my words. I am going to continue my attempts at posting videos daily for you, just hopefully to break up the monotony. Hopefully they won't be very long, and I want you to know that even if we don't speak every day, I think about every one of my church members every single day. I pray for you. I love you. I care about you. I'm concerned for you. And as I've said in my previous videos, I'm going to say again, in this time when we can't meet together, do reach out. Don't be an island. Don't be alone in your house. Call people, message people, text them, make some sort of communication. Doesn't even have to be significant. You don't have to go with some profound reason, although that's kind of cool when you do, but say something nice. Say something dumb. Send them something you saw that just seemed really silly. I have 3 or 4 friends that almost every day, either I message them with some silly thing I saw on Facebook, or they message me. But do keep that as an option. Practice it. I love you all, and I pray for your peace and your health. And I hope that you'll join me in continuing to pray for both our state and our country. You'll pray for this world that has been totally turned upside down in trying to mitigate the damages and the loss of life that comes from the pandemic of COVID-19. So long, and we'll see you next time.